Welcome to Making the Impossible Inevitable podcast. This show is for those who see progress as a calling, not just a choice. Hosted by former Navy SEAL and transformational guide Curt Cronin, each episode explores the mindset, strategies, and stories of extraordinary leaders who've turned the impossible into reality. These episodes are more than just conversations. They're a challenge to you to expand your capacity, shatter inner limitations, and lead with unshakable purpose. Together, let's make the impossible inevitable.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Making the Impossible Inevitable podcast, where we explore the moments in life that seem utterly insurmountable until they become inevitable. I'm your host, Curt Cronin. In this series, we dive into the transformation, the turning points, and the truths that allow people to move beyond what once felt impossible. Today, we start at full send with a guest who is not just thinking about the future, but actually shaping it. My guest is my dear friend, Jordan Hall, a brilliant systems thinker, futurist, and entrepreneur, spent years at the forefront of technology, culture, and human development. If you've ever wondered how we navigate the chaos of our time and build a world that works, Jordan is one of the rare people who has both the pattern recognition, that intellectual genius, and the courage, that heart-centered courage to explore what's next. Here's where we begin today. The episode is about transformation at the deepest level, not just a societal scale, but personally. Jordan opens up about his own journey from hyper-intellectual mastery to learning how to truly love, from seeing the world through logic to stepping into deep relational wisdom. And here's why I think you'll love it. One, if you've ever felt stuck in a version of yourself that no longer serves you, this conversation will challenge you to step to the next portal. Two, if you've wrestled with the question of how to be fiercely independent and deeply connected, the yes and, Jordan has some profound insights. And third, if you've ever felt like the world itself is at a breaking point, this episode is about radical hope, what it takes to rebuild both personally and collectively. This isn't just an intellectual conversation, it's a call to action. A challenge to develop what Jordan calls cathedral consciousness, the ability to commit to something larger than ourselves, even if we never see it completed. So buckle up. This is going to be a deep dive into heroic courage, infinitesimal courage, and the war that's actually worth fighting. Jordan, I'm so elated, honored, ecstatic, blown away to be able to do this podcast with you at this time, at this moment. And it's such an incredible gift. I am going against all of my known rational, logical fears to do this podcast because I do feel like it is this moment and portion of it feels more called than anything I've done in terms of being able to. My highest hope is I have had humans show up for me in the darkest depths of despair, some that I didn't even know that I was in, and grab my hand and pull me out. And so part of the title is I'm hoping that someone at some point Googles impossible when they feel like they're in an impossible situation, and they'll get to hear the stories of, the people that have shared their life experiences on this podcast and go, oh, well, if those people can do it, I can do it. And so, if I can see other humans, and I'm from a tiny farm town in the middle of nowhere, and if we can have this conversation, then ideally that time capsule goes to wherever it needs to be at the moment that needs to be there. So super excited and elated to have you here and to share your story, which to me is unbelievably impossible and now unbelievably inevitable, and really get some of your context and perspective that is unique to you.
Also, by the way, from a small town, but it used to be more in the middle of nowhere. It's called Helotes, Texas. It's much less in the middle of nowhere now, but still small town in Texas. Not quite a farm boy, but I get it.
So, in the ever present now, if we look back in the past, like what is something that in your past felt deeply impossible to you, and to the greatest extent possible, bring us back to kind of the difficulty and how impossible it felt. And then I'd love in any way you want to share, what path did you go? Who did you reach out to? What was your nonlinear process for finding a way to get to it now being inevitable and something deep in your past that's now you could look back and say it's easy, but at the time I'm sure that at the moment it was not.
Yeah, that's the hard part, because you really do have to run back the clock, because once you've kind of, I guess the exact point is gone through the transformation of self. That is precisely the point. All right, let me say something the other way. When we say that something is impossible, when we feel that something is impossible, we obviously mean impossible for. Right? It is impossible for my dog to fly, but it's not impossible for a bird to fly. So when something is impossible for me, what that means is the only thing left is for me to become someone else. Right? And so, of course, once you become someone else, it's a little bit more difficult to go back and feel the place where, or the identity where the impossibility was so present and so heavy. And I will sort of preemptively, actually, literally, I will beg forgiveness for the fact that I am aware of the degree to which I'm not, let's just say normal, a normal person. So some of the things that I might say will seem absurd to most people. Like most people can be like, that was impossible. You're out of your mind. What are you talking about? Loser. And point of fact, yeah, exactly. That's the point. Now, there are things that I've always been able to do. This is the other part of it. I've always been able to do that many other people found to be difficult or impossible. And so in many cases, for me, a lot of the stuff that was actually, I'll give you an example. So 1999, me and four of my friends, most of whom were my college friends, with effectively no business experience and effectively no relationships or contacts, decided to go to war with the two biggest tech companies in the world at the time, Microsoft and Apple.
Makes sense.
Yeah, of course. It's wisdom, the wisdom of a 29-year-old. And in the context of trying to change the trajectory of how video was rolling out on the internet, which we felt was actually important and fun. And we did it, right? We were successful. We were able to outcompete those companies and lots of other big companies in the meantime, and did meaningfully change the shape of video on the internet. And but the thing is, that wasn't of the same category. That was hard for sure, but it felt quite doable. By contrast, let me think, how far out is this? Like 7 years later? Not even that. 4 or 5 years later. Sitting in a place of being sort of an embryonic master of the universe in the techie world, having to come to terms with the fact that I didn't really know how to have the full or even a reasonable fraction of the human experience. I mean, literally down to the notion that I had to have a conversation with somebody about what does it mean to feel? Like, what is a feeling? Now, in some sense, obviously, I could taste bitterness and I could see the light. So I had sensoria, but the portfolio of sophistication and nuance that I had for being able to understand and distinguish between, say, anger and frustration was shockingly limited. And I'm not kidding. And we're talking about a 35-year-old parent who has successfully gone through a lot of strategically challenging environments. But the thing that turned out to be impossible was actually just being able to be in a loving relationship with the people who I love.
And my 4 prayers and meditations right now are on for awareness, discernment, wisdom, and grace. And so how did you come upon that awareness that was even important? Because it sounds like that was a new distinction for you. Like, how did that even show up as something that needed to be pursued?
Yeah. That's a good question, because we're kind of zooming in on the notion of, how does that even work? If you haven't got eyes, how do you know that you're blind? Something like that. Mm-hmm. So in my case, it was just a profound level of frustration and sadness and coming to the end of my rope, right? So this is one of the great problems of actually having competence, that you try to, if you're really good with a hammer, you really try to think that everything's a nail. And
you
then
just nailed the seal philosophy.
Yeah, there we go. This is such a funny juxtaposition. I'm going to be shocked to see how this plays out. Yeah, it nailed the seal philosophy. So I was really, really good at some stuff, and shockingly, utterly, completely absent a bunch of other stuff. And so, of course, like many, I tried to figure out how to solve, let me think, was a good, the saw problem with a hammer, which, you can hammer a board in half if you really, really want to. But it's quite ragged. It's not a very, very clean cut. And so what happened was that my relationships were just terrible. Like, my relationships with the people who I had really intended and committed to being in forever, like literally being in relationship with them forever, particularly my kids, just were not anywhere near where they wanted to be. And my awareness of that, my awareness of the lack was quite clean. Like, this is not good. This is not working. I'm not feeling positive. I am not feeling kind. I'm feeling sort of frustrated and angry all too often. And self-recriminatory, starting to get engaging in sort of identity. What's that called? I can't remember what it's called. Basically establishing that my identity was the problem. Like I literally was not worthy, which in some sense was actually true in a very profound way.
And fascinating is, and often a cop out, because as soon as you can say that it's just me, then you don't have to work on it. So like, that's to me, your courage to say, I would like it to be just me, but I'm not settled. I will not live in this depraved state anymore. It sounds like you hit a moment of no more, never again.
Yeah. Yeah. And the weird thing is, oh man, this is theologically true. The weird thing is then at that point, surrender, to actually be able to say, I need help. I don't know how to do this. And it's so far beyond my capacity. There's no way I'm going to get there on my own. So I actually just need help. And so in this case, I remember actually having conversations with a gentleman, Sebastian, who was willing to help, willing to say, hey, why don't you just like read this book? Think about this for a little while. And we had probably 5 or 6 conversations. At a certain point, he said, you're not going to be able to think your way out of this one.
You can't use your current superpower. You're going to have to evolve a new one.
You got to have a whole new superpower. And I was far enough down the path of just being at the end of my rope that I was actually willing to put down that superpower and go back to complete vulnerability, complete infancy. So, okay, what now? And it's funny, like I'm not kidding at all. He says, okay, what are you feeling right now? I'm like, I don't even know exactly what you mean. Like, honestly, I'm not quite sure exactly what you mean by that. And it's beautiful how kind he was. He's like, well, let's make it simple. Do you have any physical sensations? Right? Because if you don't, then we're really going to have to get really, really detailed. It's like, yeah, okay, I can feel there's cold air. I'm sitting on a chair. I can feel like my lower back. I got kind of this warm feeling in my chest. He's like, you have a warm feeling in the center of your chest, huh? I'm like, yeah, I can feel it. He's like, what's that? I'm like, no, I don't know what that is. He goes, that might be a feeling. So just kind of like for the next few days, just keep your eye on that. Just pay attention to what sensations you're having, and notice if any of those sensations aren't obviously sort of directly, purely, obviously physical. And again, I have already preemptively confessed that is the beginning of a journey of becoming a completely different kind of person, which enabled me to do things, in this case, to truly love another human being well, which is not a small thing, with significant effort. So it's weird to be in that, like to be having that be the example, but that's the example. Like that's the actual reality. I was able to go through that journey and come out the other side in a way that I can say, one, I am a profoundly different person who suffers a lot more in a very particular quality. And holy smokes, was that a good idea? That was so unspeakably worthy.
I mean, just for everyone that doesn't know Jordan, because I realized I was so excited to drop in, I didn't properly introduce him. Probably the most brilliant human I have met, an incredible thought leader, unparalleled at all forms of pattern recognition in an intellectual concept. And so, to me, what he's sharing is deep and inspiring beyond because of who you are, that challenge is even more insurmountable, to lay down that incredible gift, that incredible intellectual knowledge that and pattern recognition is, I mean, that's part of why you're shaping what the future looks, because you have the capacity to look, hey, here's what 10 years in the future could look and can hold that in a brilliant space. And to say, I'm going to surrender all of that out of my deepest desire to be able to commit fully to relationships in a way that I have not is extraordinary and unbelievably courageous.
Yeah, man, I love the fact that we are in some very distinct sense, like our backgrounds are so distinct, because we're going to share a lot of similar sensibilities on the stuff that matters. And yet, the world that's going to look at you and say, that's a guy who's got competence is in many cases going to say my competence is irrelevant. And to be perfectly frank, probably vice versa. So right now what we're doing is we're pointing to the people who would think that our superpowers are really neato and saying, okay, I'm going to I'm going to say, listen to Curt. Curt has a wisdom that is coming from a very different place, and I'm vouching for it as a kind of critical wisdom. And you just did the same thing in my direction. So there's something going on that emerges betwixt, right? Emerges between something that can only emerge between, and only when you're able to bridge the gap of being very different that allows that emergence to come forward and to be very, very rich. So, I mean, you just mentioned like you've been through some pretty serious journeys yourself, and it's, it's so crazy. Remember, it's funny. We connected over that essay I wrote on Infinitesimal Courage. Like you're actually the poster child. Maybe I wrote that essay specifically and exclusively for you.
I've quoted you like 1,000 times on that. To me, it's the most powerful because what Jordan's referencing is in combat, I found heroic courage was actually much more present than infinitesimal courage. It is actually much easier to be in surrender to a thing and say, I'll give up my life, when it is a very clear delineation between one is right and one is wrong. And the greatest challenges in my life and greatest setbacks have been when I have compromised myself in an infinitesimal way, right? And like, did I have the conversation? My term right now is to the 100%. Did I fully express it all the way, or did I leave gaps that would allow for misinterpretation, that would allow for everything Jordan shared with the degradation of relationship, that would prevent me from doing the thing I actually want to do because I slowly degraded it over a series of iterative, devastating cuts that at the time, none of them felt the frog boiling in water. None of them felt sufficient. But in the end, I ended up facing 180 degrees out from where I ever wanted to be, or wherever I imagined I could be.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is, I mean, that's such a huge, I'm glad we're talking about that. So if we're speaking maybe for example, to Gen Z, which both of us have a relationship with Gen
Z.
Deep
relationship.
And we love and care for it, and our hearts are just shattered by the difficulty that generation has been handed. The image I frequently have is this image of the boys, and they are in fact boys, coming out of the landing craft, charging machine guns on the beaches of Normandy, and the terror of that, and the heroic courage that is necessary to chase that down. Which, broadly speaking, were our grandparents, my grandfather, your grandfather, and to be perfectly frank, my recognition of the distinct lack of infinitesimal courage that those same boys had for the rest of their lives. And the war, and I really do think it is properly understood as a profound war that is present to us now, is one where heroic courage will be necessary, but infinitesimal courage is also now central. It is the core virtue. And so being able to have that 100%, being able to just stand in these very subtle places where your heart, like your child's heart, is not willing to step into the light, where you're not willing to put down your superpower and assume profound vulnerability, where you're not willing to just be wounded in your core. Like that's where all of it's going to be left right now. And it's a tricky business.
Well, and the courageousness of the vulnerability that's required in that infinitesimal courage space. Like, I don't understand what you're saying, which means I actually want to connect with you. So I'm going to ask again, because I'm not going to pretend and nod, even though I didn't understand it. I'm not going to pretend I'm in agreement because I'd rather avoid a conflict. My deep past is a people pleaser. And then in the end, that rift grows for a long period of time, right? Because of my fear of not going to be loved if I speak who I am. Therefore, I'm going to pretend to be someone I'm not, which means I can't, which means in the end, I've just delayed and made more catastrophic the inevitable collapse.
Yep. And for me, it tends to be in the direction of a distraction into something where my feeling of competence is higher. I'll route the conversation towards something where I can feel I can get a win.
so much more fun to go, you know what? We could use a hammer for this. No, that's absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. And that's that. Like, I mean, just to kind of like put it in a sociological experience, right now, I don't know how much attention is focused on the culture war or the political conflicts, but it's a lot. And a lot of attention right now is focused on big political conflicts, and people are kind of lining up on one side or the other. And they're in some sense trying to replicate the storming of the beaches of Normandy. And of course, it's beautiful that no matter what happens, I'm on the good side and they're on the bad side. But that's not actually where any of the real action is. Like all the things that are happening at that level. And I mean this apropos of your previous point. I mean this from the point of view of like pattern recognition. The things that are happening at the ostensibly big, political, cultural moments, pick your poison, all the things that people have signs and, protest and argue about and get on TV and talking heads and all that. That's all ephemeral. And what I mean is the forest is on fire. The forest is going to burn. It doesn't quite matter exactly which tree burns first or whether the wind blows one way or the other. At a macro level, there's something going on right now in history, and a very large fraction of what's playing out is going to go in a certain direction, and the details, while we will get worked up by them, and by those details, and I don't mean at all to play this out, include people being harmed. Like there will be suffering, but that suffering is not something that we're going to be able to exit from the story. And for almost everybody, and maybe for everybody, but for almost everybody, it is a complete distraction. And the profound work of actually just settling into meaningfulness, settling into what does a meaningful life actually look like? How do I get myself in a context where I'm actually just in real relationships with real people who I have the capacity to love? And I mean this, by the way, very concretely. We can double click on that if you'd like. I spent the last 2 weeks thinking very closely about that. And where, by the way, I'm also being loved, and we're supporting each other, and we know each other, and we can trust each other. We've worked on this question of trust and trustworthiness. Like that's where all the action actually is. And yet, because that requires infinitesimal courage, it's all too easy to just distract yourself up into what is effectively the Super Bowl or the NBA game of politics and culture war up here.
Well, that's why I definitely want to double click on love, both of our favorite topic, I believe. But first, I wanted to make sure we captured, because I think all those distractions are the desire to pull it into the known universe of, what I heard you say is you had this known universe of pattern recognition, and you transcended into the unknown universe, or descended. You went through that valley of despair of I'm going into the unknown, and that courage you had because of your incredible intellect was extreme. And so I loved it. Did you have any sense of I'm jumping off a cliff? Like for me, every time I go through one of those portals, I feel almost totally. Like, I'll call it, I'm going to die if I go through this portal. On the other side, it's always, oh, well, that was easy, but it requires full commitment to step through. And so if you said, what is one of the greatest challenges I see in the world today? If the greatest challenge of anything that has been impossible to me is because I was not willing to surrender to that which I don't know. I wasn't willing to be vulnerable. I wasn't willing to open up and say, can you help? Right? The hardest question for someone that struggles with their identity and their worth. And I thought I was a human being, therefore I'm only valued for what I'm doing I thought I was a human doer instead of a human being, right? Where I'm valued for existing. Mm-hmm. So I'd love any other context you have on that, which then leads to your journey to love, and anything you want to say on that.
Well, just to maybe even just continue to use the phrase, the frame of heroic courage and infinitesimal courage, the frame of I'm going to die, or I'm willing to die. And the thing that's crazy is that you're dying all the time. When you transition from one moment to another moment, or more specifically from one identity to another identity, some significant part of you, and particularly a part that really, really wants to be the whole of you, is in fact dying. That's really the case. And so one of the reasons why you avoid going through those portals is because that fear of death is before you. And you actually have to take the heroic sensibility of, I'm going to surrender that fear of death and put that aside and step into the thing that I now know is necessary. In spite of it, irrelevant. Like I'm rendering that no longer the thing. And as you said, you step through that portal and then you go through and by the way, the reality is some part of you does die. But the one who's on the other side of the portal is okay with that. It's like, okay, that was
thank heavens.
Yes, thank heavens. That was a proper That was a proper choice. And now I'm somebody where a lot of things that had seemed utterly impossible are now just part of reality. Like not even easy, but just are what is. And that's a serious thing. Like a serious challenge is to be able to surrender your fear of death and be able to step through the portals that are afforded you and just continue to go through this process of self-transformation. And I can make it, there's a subtle point here that's very, very delicate, and it's not necessarily everybody's, but there's some people, of which I'm a member, who say, oh, well, that's okay. I will now craft an identity around surrendering my fear of death before portals and going through portals. Do you get that? What happens there? I can
play it again so I can fully grok it.
Yeah. So like level 1, I'm a reasonable, rational, competent person. I lay that down. I surrender that identity. I go through the portal. I grow into a deeper, richer person. Fair enough. Oh, level 12. Not that I'm a reasonable, rational person, but I'm in fact a person who surrenders his identity, lays it down, and goes through the portal. Well, how can you surrender that? Because that's already who you have identified as. That's a very tricky trap. So we'll leave that to the side.
It almost becomes significance logic on its own.
Exactly. So there's a handful of people who we know for whom that is the place they're stuck. And it's a really, really tough one to get out of. But for most Zoomers, they haven't gone there yet. And in that case, I would just recommend humility. You just take the humility of being who you actually are and don't worry about trying to formulate an identity. Just have a character and have relationships.
And my guess is anyone that's listening will know this from your presence. But do you mind sharing what it's like going from the slight warm feeling in your chest to the explosion of what you feel now?
What is it like? Well, actually, so first order, it's really hard. It's really hard. I would imagine it's like trying to like if you got into an accident and you've lost, say the ability to walk, and you're going through physical therapy and having to regrow nerves and have to rebuild muscles. I mean, it's excruciating, to be perfectly honest. Particularly when you the proper time to do that is when you're 2, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there. And so when you're doing it when you're 50 or whatever, 42,
second best time is now.
Yeah, exactly. The second best time is now. But you get very well acquainted with grief. You get very well acquainted with the fact that suffering is not just not to be avoided, but is intrinsic to growth. Meaningless suffering is a totally different kind of thing than suffering. That distinction is an important one to land. But then, of course, you begin to realize that there's just the scope of relationship that you can get into, like the quality, the intensity, it actually is the fabric out of which meaning is made. So to live a meaningful life is to be able to enter into love, right? Loving relationships, meaningful relationships with people, persons. And so what it feels like is that life is worth living.
Aliveness.
That's intense, by the way. Like, it's weird. So when I moved here to Black Mountain about 2 years ago, about 6 months in, I'm sitting there talking to my wife, and I'm like, there's a weird experience I'm having, and I think I finally figured it out. I think this is what it means to be home. Like, I've lived 52 years, and I've never actually felt what it feels like to be home. And now I feel it. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, it's more or less the same thing. I actually had to go stand out on the deck and stare at the ocean for 2 hours. It's like, I actually know what it feels like that life is actually worth living, as opposed to I'm just surviving, and surviving is just the nature of how reality is. And I've chosen not to turn that off. It's like, no, life is actually worth living. Like, the feeling of that is a qualitative thing.
I mean, to me, you just described the most unbelievable journey. And I always say it's the furthest 12 inches in the universe are from head center to heart center, right? From logic into heart center. And to me, you just beautifully described that transition.
Yeah. So let's go the opposite direction for a second, because I think I want to spend a little time building some tools for love, because I think it's, how do I say it? Well, no, I'll just do it. There was a kerfuffle in the social field, I think about 2 weeks ago, about this term that I'd never heard before. I think it's called orders of love, or amores ordanis, something like that. I think medieval, what's his name? Thomas Aquinas wrote it down. And it's basically, how do you properly order your loves? Like, what's the right kind of priorities to set? And there's a big fight about it, because broadly speaking, as our culture tends to do, it ended up getting polarized into what is Team Red's version and what is Team Blue's version. How do they throw shit at each other over the wall? So here's the thing that came from me thinking about this pretty deeply, actually. And it's, we, and by we, I mean, I think most people alive today, like, even, doesn't matter west or east, but most people alive today really don't have any idea how to love. It's like and this is why, this is what I mean. Love requires intimacy, and intimacy requires vulnerability. And to be able to achieve both vulnerability and intimacy, but I mean skillfulness, being able to actually be intimate, not to be invited into intimacy, but to actually be able to participate in it. Funny, my daughter does not like as much when I rub her back as she likes it when her mom rubs her back, because I have calloused, rough hands, and my mom has gentle, soft hands. My wife, her mom, has the capacity to be intimate in the category of rubbing her back that is greater than mine, by the sheer fact of physicality of my hands. Just imagine this scene. Right? So you're born as an infant. You're born, and you're born into a context where every human being you know, and every human being you ever will know, is capable of profound intimacy and profound vulnerability with each other. And that's been the case for all of them as well. So it is rare beyond comprehension to encounter anyone for whom love is not a primary, fundamental, unconscious capacity of profound skill. And so as you're growing up, every encounter you have, you're encountering with somebody else who has an open, rich, tender heart and cares for you utterly deeply. Everybody you've ever met in your entire life, that is the primary tone of your experience. And so therefore, as you're going out into the world and suffering the ordinary suffering of being a human, you're held in that envelope, which means that you're able to drink in the fullest possibility of the suffering that you're encountering to develop an even richer capacity to be in a relationship with other people. That's the base case for being able to love other people. Now compare that to our lives. In our lives, we're on the receiving end of 10, 20,000 years of not having anybody have that as their experience. We're on the receiving end of people being forced for 2,000 generations to give up almost everything about their capacity to love in order to be able to survive. Right? And this, I focus specifically on your caste. There was a terrible moment in human history when it became discovered that if you convert boys into killers, you can kill your neighbors. And by the way, take their women and turn their children into your children. And about 3 seconds later, if you don't convert your boys into killers, you will be killed by your neighbors and your line extinguished. And a bomb went off where that fated decision propagated out through the entire human species, with very limited exceptions, those who were protected by vast oceans. And of course, right, if that is one of the core elements of your cultural code at the very bottom, then love is now pushed very much to the margins. So it's important for us to actually accept the reality, like really understand the reality that we are something like 1/1000th the instrument of ordered loves. That is, in fact, our actual proper inheritance. And then begin the process of swimming back towards that 100% that is the absolute bottom of infinitesimal courage. Okay, so given that as a friend, the point that I actually really want to make is like, look, love requires intimacy and vulnerability. I can achieve intimacy and vulnerability with a very small number of human beings. I cannot actually love literally my neighbor. I can be kind to my neighbor. I can hold my neighbor in a place of deep affection and endeavor very much to care for my neighbor's well-being and to listen to my neighbor. But I don't know my neighbor well enough to love my neighbor. And I haven't actually have the capacity in myself, and certainly at the time on the ground, to have been invited into a level of intimacy to actually be able to deliver anything that would properly be called love. Right? So, okay, that's just a concrete reality. So we need to be able to understand that there's a distinction between an image of love, let's say presenting a sensibility of caring for someone else. What does he call it? Benevolence. Just being benevolent, which you can be benevolent to everybody and should, by the way. Even to your greatest enemies, you should be benevolent to, which may be, by the way, removing them from the earth. But you can't love, right? You can't actually do that thing. And so to find those rare circumstances and those beautiful possibilities where love can be made available. And by the way, sometimes your neighbor will be in a circumstance. I had this in the flood. We had this big flood in Western North Carolina, and suddenly, because we had to depend on each other, the circumstances put people together where vulnerability was just present because people were actually deeply needing help. And that afforded a real possibility of intimacy, which then afforded a real possibility of love. And I want to kind of, what that means is this. I've got food. I've got water. I'm driving around trying to figure out how to help my neighbors. I go up to a neighbor. My neighbor needs help. First order, I'll be benevolent. I will offer food and water. My neighbor doesn't want food and water. My neighbor wants to feel like she's being taken care of. My neighbor wants to feel like she has a safety net. She wants to feel like she's seen and heard and understood. That's what she wants. And until I actually am able to slow down and open myself up to being able to perceive what she actually is showing me, I'm not loving her. I'm almost using her as an instrument of my own desire to feel like I'm doing a good job.
I feel like I'm contributing.
Yeah, that's a totally different.
So transactional. I missed her. Yep.
I totally blew by. I was like doing benevolence, trading in benevolence, but without intimacy, it's not actually love. And so to slow down and be there. Oh, okay. I'm just gonna sit with you. I'm gonna let you talk at me for 2 hours, because frankly, it's going to take hours before your heart is prepared to even begin the process of entering into anything like a real relationship, certainly with me and frankly with anybody, because you're in a state of real crisis. And the point is that's an example where love is a small, tiny little kernel of love was actually possible because the circumstances forced us to need each other. But obviously in our contemporary world, we actually do desperately need each other like crazy, but without infinitesimal courage, we'll never cross that chasm. We tend to be in this transactional mode of mutually shared benevolence and a simulation of love where I create an identity structure. I load the appropriate behaviors associated with that identity structure. I see if it fits you adequately. And then once it does, I project those benevolent architectures on top of you, whether or not they map you at all. I'm just giving you food and water, thinking that's exactly what you need because I've identified you as a person in need of X, Y, or Z. And this is, all right. So first, that's trouble. That situation right there is trouble. The fact that love is actually, in fact, properly ordered by the sheer nature of reality and where intimacy and vulnerability are and how they operate in time on and what it takes for our wildly disordered selves and the tremendous amount of trauma that's just been carved into us for thousands of generations means that we should recognize that love is extremely scarce, extremely precious, extremely difficult to pull off, and is only going to be located in very rare circumstances, and is therefore even more critical. I want to say it's like the highest value thing that we can try to participate in.
and has to be sought and cherished. I mean, when you were talking about, yes, first we weaponized, humans, and then quickly the other side had to weaponize. My wife and my 4 girls, we both have lots of feminine in our life, would say I'm a rookie at intimacy and vulnerability. At the professional level or at the scale level, the crisis of combat operations, to me, that drove that intimacy and vulnerability the only rule was it's okay if you have it. It's totally okay if you don't have it. Like, that also is 100% acceptable. The only thing wasn't acceptable is to say you have it and not, right? So you had to be completely open, completely vulnerable, completely naked at all times, because it was the only way the collective had a chance of survival. And that was the essence of my favorite moniker from the SEALs, team guy, where like this, you become more individual than you've ever been by bringing your superpower into the collective, and it compensates for your weaknesses. So the paradox of that very environment that was destructive to humanity, will allow it to, if you're in it, to accelerate the process. And then, but it comes, can I do it in an infinitesimal way in every single day in my life?
Yeah. And ultimately in service to the thing for which it was created. It's beautiful. It's wild. And it's this example you're giving, and it is actually profoundly true. It is profoundly true that it is only in this level of intimacy that you can create the capacity to form a fighting group that can have a quality of identity and a fluidity of competence that it can then fight against others effectively. And what you want is you actually want that with your relationship with your wife and your daughters. Yes. That's the actual thing that it's for. And that's, wildly enough, like, that's the actual centerpiece of what it is we are facing, is that dichotomy. We don't want to put our love into the things that we have needed to survive. We actually need to go through, let's call it the big portal, and surrender survival so that we can once again live.
Yes. And I think you've transitioned, as part of it was sharing with the viewers, here's how you overcame what was impossible and made it inevitable. The second part is send out the signal of what you're doing now to see who can help you take whatever is impossible for you now and make that inevitable in the future. So my sense, because I know you so well, is that we've inched our way into your current and future calling. But is there anything else that would be useful for anyone listening to reach out to you to help you pull this into inevitability?
Sure. We might as well go to 11.
We didn't get all dressed up for nothing.
I remember, like, how long ago was this? I guess it was late 2020. So golly, 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. I was in Hawaii, and I was sitting at a table in Hawaii, and we were talking with a gentleman, and somebody asked me a question, and he said, well, given what you're saying and what we're all seeing about the state of the world, what do you think the likelihood is that humanity makes it through all this? And so when people ask me a question, I think about it. And so I go, I'm actually noticing 2 different answers to that question. The part of me that addresses a question like that from the point of view of, let's say, probability, that part of me actually concludes the answer is 0. It's
from a
impossible.
Logical perspective of the level of consciousness we currently have. Exactly.
You got it. Ain't going to happen. And that's important, right? Any amount of trying to figure it out from the level of consciousness that we currently have, frankly, is just going to make matters worse. Definitely isn't going to solve the problem. Okay. But there's another part of me that doesn't even think in probabilities. That's not how it addresses the world. That part of me is like 100%. It's going to, or not even 100%. It's going to happen. In fact, it already has happened.
Yes.
And it was interesting to me because that, I kind of do everything on the fly, noticing, okay, that's a beautiful symmetry, because it actually is the part of me that thinks it's impossible is the part that has to surrender, the part that has to say, hey, I'm going to hand this off to you who I can't even really understand by definition, because you're outside of the kinds of things I can understand. But I'm going to surrender to the part of me for whom it is already true. And I mean this individually and corporately. This is like wildly critical. How do we actually put ourselves in context where we can actually start to live life from this other part? I've talked the term of like we're post strategy. We're actually in a whole category. The entire category of strategy is nearly at its end. And what that means is, what does it mean to live life that is not strategic, that is not transactional, that actually is intimate, that is truly governed by love? And I mean that very, very, very concretely, very practically, right? Not by sentiment, not by benevolence, but actually by the absolutely brutal reality of love. And that's the thing. Like, that is in fact my calling, and that is the impossibility that I'm living right now. And I've got a lot of examples of where it seems to be showing up, but boy, it is not easy. It's quite a rough thing to go through.
Yeah, to meet you fully, the scariest part of my career in the SEALs was when I realized other heads of state would allow me to go after their countrymen because they loved me. And so it was the most subtle distortion of the very gift and the very pursuit that you're on. And so it felt like, oh, now I'm on the reactive side of infinity, right? I'm on the how to act after something has already happened, right? Now, how do we get to the proactive side of infinity? How do I get to the creative side? How do we get to we create so we don't have to go to war? To hear that model where as soon as people go to scarcity, somebody was telling me, I read, the illusion of separation is the very first piece where now we've become separate. Now we are other. And then it provides conflict, and all of that comes from there. And so now how do we now build what you and I have talked about is invisible squadron? How do we now build the culture, the environment, the capacity for love at a level where we can get out of that sense of separation and get to everything I do to you, I do to me. And then now it's how do we now hold each other in a fundamentally different space?
Yeah. So yeah, to maybe say, I want to take a 60s thing and I want to pull it out and say that that's a mistake. We don't want to go there. So, and in fact, I was just illusion of separation, reality of separation. You and I are in fact separate, and that's really, really good because that's how intimacy can occur. You can only occur in an intimate relationship. You can only have a relationship with something that is not you. You can have a relationship with parts of yourself from the point of view of precisely the fact that they are parts and not you. So what we want is we actually want to have this new mode where we are simultaneously maximally separate and maximally intimate. Okay, let me just put it this way. What I'm going to do is I'll preemptively say I'm moving into nerd space for a second, and almost even like hat tip to Nerd Tribe, but of service. Like, this is Nerd Tribe. We've been out in the desert. We found some interesting stuff. We're bringing it back in, and we're bringing, it was a J2, J3. We're bringing it back in. Here's useful intelligence. Historically, there have been two big basic modes of the relationship between the individual and the group for humans. In the beginning, the group was extremely dominant, and the individual largely gets lost in the group. Then, particularly most recently, as we began to move into environments that were less coherent, or where love was in fact less available, we became more individual, more separate. So the illusion of separation began to become hardened into a increasingly obvious separation, not the least of which because you're over there and I'm going to kill you, right? I'm going to take your stuff. And what we did is we began to soften the consequences of that separation through an entire 10,000 years of civilization, to the point where, for the most part, we aren't mean to each other in a brutal way, although we still are far too much. But we're more separate now than has ever been the case. Okay. What we want to do is we want to actually finally move to a third place, like a third way, where the whole, the group, the tribe, the relationships that are coming between and among are oriented almost exclusively to the individuation and the becoming singular of the individual. And the individual is so fully aware of the centrality and necessity of the governing principles of love that they are not pulling away, but are actually coming back in to relationality as the output of their individuation. So it becomes an expanding sphere of increasingly beautiful possibility, because as each person is differentiated into their singular nature, they become more capable of providing new possibilities of relationship with everyone else. And that right there, that is what some people have called the fifth joint point, or the location in culture space that allows us to actually transcend history for real. And by history, what I mean is the story of the movement from the primordial upper Paleolithic period up until now.
So if I'm tracking, then if individuals can fully get the option to commit or not, i.e. they can be fully individual and fully separated, only then can they fully surrender into the group. So if I'm half individual and I feel like I have to have the tribe, then I don't get to fully make the decision. Therefore, it's never a full commitment. I don't ever get to go fully through the portal. Only through fully manifesting whom I am individually, then can I step fully back into the community.
Yes. Yeah. For example, like as a critical element, this is absolutely true. By being perfectly free, only by being actually fully free, can I then choose to come back into full service at 100%. And this is not, how do I say, 0% of this is airy-fairy. Like 0% of this is pure affect or fun words. Like this is the hard practicality. And again, from a nerd space perspective, it is the portal. Like it's the thing that allows us to navigate the shift from, are we going to make it, to, oh yeah, we already have. Ooh, yeah. So I'm feeling with the calling of Invisible Squadron. What I'm describing is the mission. Like all these guys who are by nature oriented to be willing to give up their lives and to protect what they love. Like that's where we are. You and I right now, what we're talking about is this calling into infinitesimal courage, this calling into a new way of doing the thing that is your nature and which you recognize as being most virtuous, most honorable. That to be willing to step into the crucible of infinitesimal courage, to be willing to step into the crucible of this quality of love as being the thing that you are actually fighting for and with. Ooh, it's a hard thing. Like I get it. Like if you're what's his name? Conor McGregor getting into a fist fight, getting punched in the face, that's not going to slow you down in a little bit. But what I'm talking about, that's a whole other thing. And if he can step into that, then he deserves full respect.
Well, the only thing that comes for me, the sense of course, right, as you speak that, like the genius, once it's heard, you can never kind of unhear it. So of course, and then I instantly go into my logic goes, okay, how? How do I do that? What are the protocols that you have established for yourself to be able to continue to follow that path?
Well, I think this is where you and I, we just start comparing notes. And so you surfaced several that I think are really powerful. And there's one of recognizing precisely where you notice in yourself that which should happen, right? The conscience, to be able to notice your conscience and notice exactly how you move away from conscience. Yeah. This conversation, this is what I should be saying, but I avoid it. Right? So these very subtle elements of how you avoid doing the thing that your heart knows is right. So how do you bind yourself to actually just doing the thing your heart knows is right? Man, ain't that tough? But that's it. Like that's the core. That's the central element for me. And I'll be like wearing what's his name, Huberman. I remember talking to him a long time ago. Well, just when he first was coming to Stanford, which is a perfectly good block, actually. If all the things that are happening in that block of the internet are turned towards the highest purpose, like how do I create the practices that don't just allow me to have a bunch of, how do I say it, effectively valueless results, but I actually say, no, I'm going to take all these practices and then harness them and yoke them to the highest purpose. Okay, now we're talking. So here's an example. Practice noticing when you turn away from that which feels hard. Like, this is very subtle. Mm-hmm. You have to Absolutely. Take the time to slow down enough to notice, oh, that thing right there, I can tell it's hard. I can feel the point where my heart is actually feeling afraid of it and I'm avoiding it. And notice that, and then just take it as an equivalent to the cold shower, like the Wim Hof method. This is the spiritual Wim Hof method. Take it as the mandate. Like I am testing right now a protocol where I'm going to turn towards that, which feels that way. Right? All the things that I have habitually avoided because they have a quality of hardness, I'm going to make it a rule that for the next week, I will just go towards that. And I will, precisely when it has that feeling, I will step into it with no other objective than just training.
Only way out is
spiritual boot camp.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Spiritual boot camp. So there's a bunch of protocols there. And it's wild. Yeah, again, I want to reinforce. Go ahead.
Sorry. The other that came from mind for me is I've never experienced more, we talk about head center, heart center, or spirit and flesh. To me, the more that I can quiet my crazy roommate, right? My mentor would call it like that. My logic running in my head, the more I can be open to the little voice that can otherwise be drowned out. And so if I get up in the morning and do 30 minutes of physical embodiment, whether it's cardio or strength, any type of physical embodiment, followed by breath work, followed by meditation, the entire day it feels somewhere between 20 and 100, right? Just to try and calibrate it, more clear and discerning on this is the path I should be on, or this is the thing I should be doing, or the lack of clarity when there's too much noise, right? It seems to cut through the noise and allow me to have much more clear on this is the thing that should be done.
Yes, absolutely. So this is fun because what we're basically doing is we're capitulating some form of like warrior monk sensibility. Because we're combining a whole variety of practices, but within a spiritual envelope and pointing them to the highest purposes. Right? So you're not just achieving a spiritual experience to be spiritual, and you're not just engaging in a variety of physical practices to achieve, but you're combining the highest possible purpose with your capacity to actually orient towards them with strength and subtlety. Right? That's sort of thing that we're talking about. So what does it look like to become a Jedi Knight? What does it look like to actually become a new kind of warrior monk? And so let's try another one. Oh, I'll do it at a mental level. This is easy. This happens all the time. Read something and pay attention entirely, first to your emotional response, and second, to your unconscious cognitive responses to that emotional response. An easy way to do that is to find somebody on Twitter that you really disagree with and follow them. And then read something that comes up as a result of their feed that you don't agree with, right? You don't like, so that you're encountering something that some other human has an opinion that's different than yours, a very unpleasant experience. But the key is to notice, okay, first, oh yeah, I didn't like that. I actually feel like them's fighting words. And second, okay, what is going on in my mind when I have that experience? Do I denigrate them in my mind? What an asshole, what an idiot. Do I produce an argument immediately to distance myself from the perspective they're having? I need to defend my territory from what appears to be a threat, like all these things. So this is a becoming sensitive to the double layer. One is the physical that precedes the mental. Oh, I'm having a physical response of effectively threat, right? I'm feeling a threat. And then what is my immediate habitual cognitive response to that threat? And of course, ultimately, the intent is, can I train myself to notice when I'm feeling threatened and then come to a place where I'm responding to that in a way that is coming from the values that I hold the most? Can I actually be first in a place of peace? Which doesn't mean, by the way, how do I say, capitulating to evil, but it allows you to actually not participate in evil unconsciously. How do you actually settle in strength and respond with maturity and wisdom, as opposed to just reacting with whatever nonsense happens to have been accumulated on top of you over the past 30 or whatever years? So we can enumerate a very long list of these kinds of things. But
yeah, that feels so true, because that's the essence of my reactions. Feel like they're from my fear-based response. Like it's an instantaneous reaction. I almost don't process, right? It just happens, right? It's almost it's a fight or flight. My reactions, where responses feel like from a centered, like expansion space. So that feels completely coherent and true.
Yeah. Yeah. And that way of describing it. So you've cultivated this for years. And so you're in a position where you could listen to what I'm saying and you can notice in yourself the consequences of your experience. And I think we're saying this is part of the, the spiritual warrior monk dojo, that piece. Do it. And as you do it, become more capable of noticing how these things have distinctions. And again, to reinforce the point, this is the war we're actually fighting. We are at war. It is a spiritual war. This is the war we're actually fighting. Anyone who is a warrior by nature, that is who they are by identity. And I mean like practically, like you've actually gone to physical war. You are called into the spiritual war, but to become capable of fighting in the spiritual war, you must go through the spiritual boot camp. And it's no joke. Like you're going to have to confess to the people who you love most because you've been an asshole and you've broken a lot of stuff, and you're going to have to repent. And you're going to have to, by repentance, I don't mean just confess and say sorry. I mean, actually in your heart, undergo the work necessary to change your heart so that your behavior is now a behavior aligned with your values. You have to actually become a virtuous person. I mean, and by the way, I'm not among the class of virtuous people, so I'm not speaking from above. I'm speaking from inside. And I'm not sure if you can get out of that, but I know you can make forward progress. That much I know. And I know that the more people who make forward progress will begin to notice, who are the Spartans? I like that was a distinction you used to make, right? Spartans and pirates.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and that's been one of the distinctions as we were preparing for this, the discernment for me of, like I am perfectly flawed and imperfect, and I can be called to be virtuous. I can be called and aspirationally follow that call, knowing I will never achieve it, but that's what I love about collective, right? I will do more for others than I will for myself. I will hold myself to a standard differently, knowing that I've professed it to you. And there was a situation in December where I ended up, every physical cell in my body did not want to execute on what I knew to be true, but I knew I could no longer hold Communitas with people whom I respected if I did not follow the path. I couldn't look at my kids in the eye and say, I want you to do the thing when it's time to do the thing. And so the relationships, to me, what you were saying earlier about relationships generating meaning, the relationships allowed me to have a meaningful life, where if it was individual, I would have checked out and accepted death because it seemed safer than going through that path.
Nice. Yeah. So that notion of communitas, so we can maybe even double click on that. So what happens is when you become capable of entering into communion with others, and I like the idea of, I'm just going to say that communion is this previous relationship that I was describing, where the whole is canonically pouring itself into each individual in order, and from a place of profound love and intimacy for the growth of the individuals, who then return it as they grow, creating more possibility for the whole. Right. So that's the communion. And when you're in communion, the identity of that whole is now supporting you, and so you can do things that you couldn't have done. You can
absolutely
rest in that strength and be carried through it. And it's powerful because I need you to do the thing that you're afraid to do. And so, I need you to, for all of us to survive, for all of us to grow. And I am now committed to giving you whatever I can give you, which is very careful. Like I can't give you something that is not mine to give. But if it is instantaneously necessary that I give it. Right? See that, and this is you've actually seen it. That is what happens in the SEAL team on the ground when they are actually in the field. We're just saying that exact same capability needs to be brought into the whole of life.
Yeah, and is required and is full of aliveness and is the most exhilarating. I mean, one of the things that was coming to me as you were sharing was it's the redefinition of experiences that I've had from a fear place as, the thing, right? And so every single time before I go onto a stage, get into a conversation like this at this level, like I feel like tightness across my chest. It's a constriction. It's a fear of, what if I don't do the thing? What if, I can feel that constriction. And now that's also like, this is the thing that's important, right? This is important. If it wasn't important to me, it wouldn't matter. So therefore, this is to your point about, this is what I should surge into. I'm surging into it because now in the convocation, the expansion of like, this is like, a conversation we've had epic conversations for years, but never at this level of intensity, at this moment, at this space, at this time. So like, it's the understanding of the ego's desire to survive is the spirit's desire to surrender, right? Like almost like a completely reflexive mirror.
That was good. that was real good. Underscore. I felt nervous before we had this call. I don't feel nervous very much. At least doing calls. I feel nervous plenty when I'm interacting with my kids. Which is, again, but I was like, okay, that's a good sign. That means this is actually meaningful. There's something going on here, which a large part of me is trying to muster, okay, we're going to stay focused. We're going to put something out there. And it's funny. I can actually see in my mind's eye, because this is going to be a podcast, right? You're actually beginning a podcast. You're producing something you're going to be conveying out there. And at some point down the road, you're going to be talking to exactly. Episode 1. So at some point down the road, you're going to be talking to somebody who's actually famous. And that's going to bring a whole bunch of people in, and they're going to come back and they're going to watch this episode. And many of them are going to be really pissed off. Many of them are going to be some combination of triggered, annoyed, or pissed. They're going to be pissed off. And I can see the comments. And the key message is something like, yeah, we probably are doing a mediocre job right now because we're on the tightrope, right? That we're in it. Like we're trying to figure out how to do this thing. How do we create the right kind of field? How do we actually demonstrate what it's like to be, again, doing that Navy SEAL thing? Like this is improv. We're improv right now in the most meaningful, like we're trying to actually tackle the most meaningful question with the highest degree of particularity. And of course, we're both 1.1% qualified for what we're trying to do.
Generous. Maybe you are.
Yeah. And so yeah, exactly. And here's the invitation. If anything that's happened in the last, 90 minutes has pissed you off, consider that a really, really good sign and a challenge to look at that particular piece and say, okay, that's almost like God tapping you on the shoulder and say, look at that right there. Something really valuable will happen if you just look at that. Man, it's crazy.
No, and you hit, because that's what I said earlier when you were going through, what do I do when I get the most upset and judge others, or when I react most heavily? It's usually something which, and it's a dear friend of mine, Dwayne Kerrigan's quote. I don't know where he got it, but it's like, hey, that which most upsets you about others, the thing you have not yet accepted in yourself. And I was like, that is almost universally true for me. I'm like, why am I so mad at this? I'm like, because I don't want to accept that.
Yeah. And this is key. This does not mean that Curt and I are off the hook, or that does not mean that we didn't just screw something up. We probably did. But if it pissed you off, that's a different kind of thing. It's, I see people do stuff that I'm like, let's just think again, just orient from like parent-child. If you watch your child riding a bike and they fall off their bike, that doesn't piss you off. They're making a mistake, trying to do something earnest. That's a totally different kind of thing than when somebody like cuts you off in traffic. And the The reason why that pisses you off has nothing to do with the fact that they're an asshole, because they are. It's a different kind of thing that it's like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on in me? What's happening in my life that I can't just be at peace with the fact that sometimes there are people, they're assholes in traffic sometimes. Well, the reality is my life is probably extremely agitated. Like I'm actually probably chewing on stuff in the back of my mind constantly. I'm in a basal level of agitation and anxiety and ire. Like I'm actually not at peace in myself, in my body, and my ability to actually just process of anger coming up without losing my shit. Well, that's where I am, right? And so if you're there, the fact that they cut you off and that caused you to react in a certain way, that's the sign. Say, hey, okay, man, I need to resolve some things so that I can navigate reality in a place of peace, which does not forgive them or excuse them of being assholes, but you're not going to solve the problem of them being assholes by getting pissed off. And you're not going to solve the problem of me being incompetent by getting pissed off, but you can solve some problems in yourself if you notice that's a sign.
I think you brilliantly brought to life all the concepts that I was hoping to bring into this, which is if we perceive it's impossible. You said it's for a dog or for a person. To me, it was also a time frame. Like it's impossible in 1980 or 1990 or at the current moment. Like the Einstein quote. Like the two that I love are like the problem, the level of consciousness that created a problem cannot solve it. And then the other is, one choice in life, either everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle. And so to me, we've been playing with both of those. And then I think you've given some unbelievably guided responses on how to feel into that field, how to lean into, okay, if I'm agitated, remember my brother told me the first time, I think in our entire lives at that point where we had a conflict, he's like, well, I came to everything I want in life is just peace. I'm like, but you mean like a motivated peace, right? Because I was in my full achiever mode and I couldn't understand peace as what you're describing it as, aliveness, right? Full integration and aliveness.
Mm. So
anything else we can do to support you on your quest? Anything that's out there to be helpful on your epic mission? Mission
okay,
impossible.
this is fun.
We are all in to help you make inevitable. Yes.
Well, I would hope so, because it's actually everybody's. It's in everybody's interest that we make it through this portal. This is a weird way of saying it, but as I've already mentioned that I'm weird, you're just going to have to live with that. There's a phrase that I've been thinking about. I think I've said it a few times. I call it and it has to do with actually two very distinct things that I think are beautiful. One, if you go, I think mostly to Europe, and you sit in a cathedral, Notre Dame is a fine example, or the Cologne Cathedral. You're in a place that was built over a time frame longer than the United States has been around. Right? They started building it hundreds of years before they finished building it, which meant that the people who were in the beginning of building it, not only did they not have a notion that that they would live in it, they knew for sure that not even their great-great-great-grandchildren would actually be in it, which is a long time to be building something for. And yet they're completely capable. And by the way, not just of like once or twice, 2 weekends coming out and kind of doing something. So we're not talking about planting a tree and then being done planting trees. They dedicated their whole lives to it. So they were able to dedicate their whole lives to doing something that would not be realized until generations had come that had completely forgotten that they existed. Great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Well, that's a whole different kind of capability. You can't have a strategic mindset. That's not transactional. That requires that you're actually just in surrender to something that is greater than yourself and that gives meaning to everything you do intrinsically. A cathedral consciousness. The second part of it is that thing that is greater than yourself is greater than yourself. And to surrender to it because you have a feeling of not just that it's greater than you, but also much, much more capable of good, much, much more capable of love than you. That by surrendering to it, you're guided into a higher level of being able to participate in good and beauty and truth than you ever could on your own. All right? Those are two distinct and very beautiful things. And this allows a person to live a life that is really pulled forward into incredible capabilities. You can truly do the impossible in a way that impossible is uniquely tied towards the highest. And so this is a weird thing. The best that anybody can do to support me is to cultivate cathedral consciousness in themselves. And I'm not at all kidding, because what will end up happening is somebody somewhere sometime will have exactly the stone that I need to complete the arch that I've been working on and that I can't get. But if they've surrendered to cathedral consciousness, they will know to start walking in my direction. They'll hand it off to their great-grandson, who will hand it off to my great-grandson, and he will complete the arch. And that is absolutely exactly what I need.
Thank you. Your time is a gift. Your message a gift. You are a gift.
All right, thank you, brother. It's going to be interesting to see what happens next.
Most people don't realize they're wearing a mask, which hides their true power without even knowing it. But the people you work with, your friends, your family, and the world need you to step into the power of your authentic self. Take our free mask assessment to uncover which of the 15 masks you are unconsciously wearing that shapes your life and how you can start to break free. Start your journey at akeypartners.com and step into the power of your authentic self.